What about Glasgow Statute's plans for removing, including David Livingstone, an anti-slaver? Good point, Kenny. Let's talk about that. What this is about, right? Now, some of you will have seen the news today that the media is saying that a report has been published which is condemning David Livingstone, one of Britain's foremost anti-slavery campaigners. They've found a link with slavery because apparently when he was a 10-year-old boy, he was working in a cotton mill in Blantyre. Now, let me just give you some backstory on this. What this is it is a consequence of this report, which we're working through, called Glasgow, Slavery and Atlantic Commerce, an audit of historic connections and modern legacies, by Stephen Mullen, who apparently is a historian at a university. And he's been commissioned by the people who misrule us in Glasgow City Council to basically go through all of Glasgow's history, all its statues, all its street names, all its buildings, all its famous people, and find links to slavery, and to find tenuous links. Oh, tenuous links, my goodness me. And when there's not a direct link, he'll find an association. And he even tells us, I mean, it's a well put together document in that he's been really careful about doing it all to find the most obscure links with the most obscure people. And it's not just about who owned slaves. You won't actually find very many of them, but it's about who profited, what they're saying, who profited from this, the trade in tobacco and sugar and cotton and so on between the 1600s to the late 1700s and thereafter for a few years as well. And then also people who were involved with financial businesses which were related to companies that engaged in tobacco and trade, tobacco and cotton and trade with the West Indies. And then people who derived fortunes inherited from parents or grandparents who were involved in that trade. And also people who are, as he calls it here, involvement with the imperial infrastructure. That is politicians, military, naval, and others that imposed, extended, and perpetuated slavery. In other words, his definitions here extend to virtually everybody. I mean, I'm involved because I live in a city that 200 years ago had people living in it who traded with the West Indies and who knew people in the West Indies who had plantations, some of whom owned slaves. So, I'm complicit. And I'm not joking when I say this, because this is exactly what the SNP Council that misrules us from Glasgow City Chambers wants us to believe. Because I'll just bring up her quote, but it was Susan Aitken today, and she's quoted in the BBC online report, and she says that this report presents, quote, an incontrovertible evidence base of the extent of Glasgow's complicity. Listen to that word, complicity, in slavery and the actions that supported it. And she added, quote, we should apologise fully and unreservedly to the descendants of enslaved people and to the nations they came from for the city's significant role in Atlantic slavery, close quote. She said that today, and I would just say to her, absolutely not. You're absolutely wrong. We have absolutely nothing to apologise for, because none of us are what you call complicit. Not a single one of us living today is in any way, shape or form complicit, and neither were our ancestors. This is it. Neither were our ancestors. Whether they were rich or poor or merchants or workers, none of them are to blame for anything, and they're not to blame for the slave trade, because prior to 1807, slavery was the normal way in which many economies not just were run, but were certainly aided by. And so it was a normal thing. It was not considered wrong. So you cannot condemn people who were involved in a system that was not considered wrong at the time. What you can do is you can condemn them if they were deliberately being bad, if they were deliberately mistreating the slaves over whom they had authority. Then they can be condemned for that. But you can't condemn our ancestors for taking part in an economy and taking part in actions which were considered to be normal. Now, what happened was, as a result of mainly a sort of growth in Christianity, especially among evangelical Protestants, by 1807, Britain passed the first act to abolish the slave trade, in 1807. And that abolished the trade in the British Empire. That is the lands over which the British had legal control to do that. And then in 1833, a generation later, they passed the next act, which abolished the practice of slavery in the British Empire. And after that, after 1833, slavery was universally considered to be wrong. But prior to that, it wasn't considered to be wrong. So Britain, from 1807 to 1833, we passed these laws, and then we enforced them. And in that regard, I've got a copy of this book which has just arrived. It's called Sweet Water and Bitter, The Ships That Stopped the Slave Trade. And I just want to read a very interesting little bit at the back here. It says, Sweet Water and Bitter is the extraordinary sequel to Britain's abolition of the slave trade in 1807. The last legal British slave ship left Africa that year, but other countries and illegal slavers continued to trade. When the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, British diplomats negotiated anti-slave trade treaties, and a preventative squadron was formed to cruise the West African coast. That's the British West African Squadron. In 6 decades, this small fleet liberated 150,000 Africans and lost 17,000 of its own men in doing so. This is the tale of their exciting and arduous campaign. Now, in other words, not only did Britain pass the laws to stop this, but we also paid in blood right up until the end of the 1800s. So that was all done and dusted back then. Today we've got nothing to apologise for at all, not a single one of us. And we certainly don't apologise for our ancestors, especially when our ancestors were operating within a world where it was considered a normal thing at the time. Until, as I say, until these laws were passed. So for somebody like Susan Aitken to say that Glasgow is complicit, how about you learn your history? Don't be putting that stuff on us today. We've got enough to bother about. We don't need false history shoved down our throats by people who have clearly got an agenda. I mean, so to go back to David Livingstone, this chap Mullen talks about Livingstone on page 53. But what's interesting is that, on page 53 he says, David Livingstone, famous missionary, was employed in Blantyre Mill, owned by Henry Monteith, who was in a partnership with 2 Glasgow West India merchants in the 1810s. Okay, so that's David Livingstone's connection to slavery. That's David Livingstone's connection. And what he doesn't say in this as well, what Mullen avoids saying, is that Livingstone was 10 years old at the time. Okay, he doesn't say that. He just glosses over that bit. But he wants to like nail David Livingstone to the wall for that, when he was a 10-year-old wee boy working in a factory in Blantyre. What sort of mentality comes up with that nonsense? But the fact that this guy has got an agenda is proven by how he treats Robert Burns. Now, Robert Burns, as many of us know, wanted to go to Jamaica to work on a slave plantation in 1786, okay? And in fact, he bought 2 tickets for 2 different journeys, and it was his intention to go and help to manage a plantation over in Jamaica. But his book of poems sold very well, and so he decided just to concentrate on being a wordsmith rather than being a manager of a slave plantation. But he gets a complete free pass here. He gets a complete free pass, and the Burns statue is not one that's to be vilified. And indeed, he goes as far as to say Robert Burns was not complicit with slavery in any tangible way. Okay? But then he goes on and basically suggests that David Livingstone was complicit in slavery as a 10-year-old working at a cotton mill in Blantyre. So this is the quality of the material here. I mean, it's interesting because this guy's he's got all sorts of interesting wee points of view that I didn't know about famous people in Glasgow. But basically, he wants to roast them all, and I don't approve of that at all. And we have nothing to apologise for. The only people who should be condemned are those who deliberately mistreated the slaves that they owned. That of course deserves condemnation. And at the end of the day, all this was done and dusted back at the start of the 19th century, back in the 1800s, and Britain, as we've just seen there, has paid substantially in blood for all of this. So we have nothing to apologise for.